Imagine sitting in a courtroom, so quiet you can hear paper turning. And then the voice of a woman cuts through the silence. She is calm, controlled, almost rehearsed. And she is speaking about the death of her husband. But behind her, her own children are watching. Not just watching the trial, watching their mother tell the world she did not kill their father. And in that moment, the courtroom is no longer just a place of law. It becomes something else, a battlefield of truth, where someone is lying and someone is broken. Because years earlier, Eric Richins was found dead in his own home. What first looked like a tragic and sudden loss slowly turned into something investigators say was far more disturbing. A case built on money, on secrets, on messages that disappeared, and on a substance so deadly, it doesn't forgive mistakes: fentanyl. But the most unsettling part of this story is not just how he died. It is what came after. A grieving widow who wrote a children's book about loss. A mother who stood in front of cameras, speaking about healing. And a suspect who, according to prosecutors, may have been playing a role from the very beginning. Because if their theory is correct, then this was never just a sudden tragedy. It was something planned. And the question that now shadows every piece of evidence is this: how does a woman go from mourning her husband to being accused of orchestrating his death? This is the case of Kouri Richins. And what follows is a story where grief, money, and suspicion collide in a way that no one saw coming. Now, to understand how this moment in court became possible, the courtroom was quiet, but not empty of emotion. Every seat felt occupied by something heavier than people. Grief, anger, questions that no one could answer out loud. And at the center of it all stood Kouri Richins, a woman now known across headlines as a suspect in the death of her husband. But in that moment, she was speaking as if none of it defined her. Her voice did not shake. She told the court she loved Eric. She told them she would never hurt him. And she described a version of herself that in her words had been misunderstood by the world watching her fall apart. To some in the room, it sounded like the final statement of a woman fighting for her life. To others, it sounded like something else entirely. Carefully composed, measured, almost too controlled for a case built on such violent allegations. Behind her, her children sat quietly, small figures in a room filled with adult consequences. And whether they understood every detail or not, they understood enough that something about their family had been permanently broken. Because this was not just a trial about what happened to Eric Richins. It was a trial about who Kouri Richins really was when no one was watching. And that is where the case becomes complicated. Because before the headlines, before the arrest, before the courtroom, there was a life that from the outside looked stable. A marriage, a home. Children growing up in what appeared to be a normal family environment in Utah. But prosecutors argue that beneath that image, something else was forming. Something hidden. Something that would eventually end in death. And the deeper you look into that earlier life, the more questions begin to surface. What really was happening inside that marriage? And how did it reach a point where one partner would end up dead and the other standing in a courtroom accused of causing it? Because, according to investigators, this story did not begin with a tragedy. It began long before that, in silence, in conflict, and in choices that were not visible to the outside world. And to understand how things reached this courtroom moment, we have to step back further, back into what some now describe as the calm before everything collapsed. Long before the courtroom, there were cameras. And in front of those cameras, Kouri Richins was not a suspect. She was something very different. A grieving widow, a mother, a woman trying to explain the unexplainable loss of her husband, Eric Richins. In public appearances, she spoke about grief in a way that felt structured, almost carefully arranged. She talked about pain, about healing, about her children. And at the center of it all, she presented a message the world wanted to believe: that a family had been shattered by sudden tragedy. But as investigators later began to piece together the timeline, those same public moments were re-examined under a very different light. Not as memories of grief, but as behavior under scrutiny. Because while she was speaking publicly about loss, prosecutors say there were private developments happening in the background that told a more complicated story. Text messages, financial records, conversations that were later pulled into the investigation. And as the case slowly shifted from unexpected death to suspected homicide, attention began to move beyond what was said in interviews and toward how everything appeared. Her expressions, her tone, the way she carried herself when describing events that were still raw in the public mind. To some observers, it raised questions, not because it proved anything on its own, but because it did not fully match what people expected grief to look like. But this is where the story becomes important to handle carefully, because behavior is not evidence, and appearances, no matter how unusual they may seem, do not determine guilt. Still, investigators were not relying on appearances alone. They were following something far more concrete: data, records, financial movement, and a timeline that began to stretch further back than the public originally understood. Because if this was only a tragic death, then everything else should align neatly. But according to authorities, it did not. Instead, it began to form patterns that suggested planning rather than panic. And once that possibility entered the investigation, everything changed. Because now the question was no longer just what happened to Eric Richins, it was whether the life presented to the public had ever reflected the reality behind closed doors. And to find that answer, investigators had to follow the one thing that never lies in a case like this: money. At this point in the investigation, the story stopped being just about a death. It became about motivation. Because when investigators looked past the public grief, past the interviews, past the emotional statements, they began focusing on something far less emotional, but far more revealing: money. And in the case of Eric Richins, money was not a small detail in the background. It was central to the life he and Kouri were building together. Real estate, business dealings, assets that were growing, but also creating pressure. And according to investigators, pressure inside a marriage does not always stay private. It builds. It shifts conversations. It changes trust. It creates tension that outsiders rarely see. Then came the financial questions that changed the direction of the case entirely. Insurance policies, estate planning, and discussions about what would happen if something ever happened to Eric. Because one of the most critical points in the investigation was this idea: if Eric died unexpectedly, who would benefit? And that question, simple as it sounds, is often where homicide investigations begin to harden into something more serious. But there was another layer. Something that many people outside the legal system had never heard of before this case gained attention. A law that exists in many U.S. states, including Utah. It is known as the Slayer Statute, and its purpose is simple. A person cannot profit from the death of someone they are accused of killing, which means if a spouse is found responsible for murder, they are legally barred from inheriting money, property, or insurance tied to the victim. And in cases like this, that changes everything, because what may have once looked like a potential financial outcome can disappear completely if criminal responsibility is proven. So investigators and prosecutors began building a timeline that connected two things: the alleged breakdown of a marriage and the financial consequences that would follow a sudden death. But this is where the case becomes even more complex, because motive alone is never enough. Not in court, not in an investigation. It must connect to opportunity, to action, to evidence that places events together in a way that cannot be ignored. And as detectives continued digging, they believed they were beginning to see exactly that connection forming. Not in theory, but in sequence. A sequence that would ultimately lead them back to the night everything changed.